Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to talk to you about the QTip test. Now the QTip test is a notorious test that folks can do to kind of check and see if they have anatomy for a VCH piercing at home. VCH is short for vertical clitoral hood, and as the name implies, this is a piercing that passes vertically through the clitoral hood. Now, you need to make sure that you have enough tissue on your hood to support this piercing, and that there's enough space underneath the hood that the piercing can be safely performed. And this is a relatively anatomy-dependent piercing. I will say most folks typically do have the anatomy for this, but there are still a decent number of folks who we do end up having to turn away just because their anatomy is not suitable for this piercing. And a lot of folks don't necessarily want to have to get undressed in front of a stranger to check and see if they have the anatomy, which I totally respect and understand. So many years ago, the QTip test was devised. QTip test generally suggests taking a small Q-tip and inserting it underneath the hood. And if you're able to get most of the head of the Q-tip underneath your hood, you are a good candidate for a VCH piercing. Now, depending on where you read about the QTip test, you may also see some suggestions to remove a little bit of the fluff from the Q-tip to make it a tiny bit smaller to see if it fits under your hood. You'll also see some folks say that you should do it with a little bit of lubrication or water on the Q-tip, so that way it fits under the hood easier. There's lots of slight variations on it, but basically, if you can fit a Q-tip underneath your hood, you can get a VCH, and if you can't, you probably can't. And I kind of hate the QTip test, if I'm being completely honest, because it absolutely does not paint a full picture of who is or isn't suitable to get a VCH piercing. My biggest gripe with it is that I constantly see people say, oh, I failed the QTip test, so I don't have the anatomy for a VCH, I can't get it done. And I go, well, the QTip test isn't always the most accurate. If you'd like to do a second consultation while you're here, we can. A lot of times the client is getting a different genital piercing, so they're already disrobed down there, and I take a peek and go, what? You've got plenty of space for a VCH. What are you talking about? We can definitely do this piercing. One of the big issues with the QTip test is that it's not really accurately measuring height. A lot of folks have very tall hoods, but they're very narrow. So fitting an entire Q-tip underneath the hood comfortably is very difficult, if not impossible. But I don't need to fit a whole Q-tip under the hood in order to do a VCH piercing. I just need to be able to fit tools or jewelry underneath the hood. I primarily freehand my VCHs and I pierce them from bottom to top. So I gently retract the hood and rest the needle underneath things, and then I pierce upwards like that. So I don't need that much width in order to be able to do this piercing and do it well. Now, the QTip test was invented during time periods when receiving tubes were most commonly used for VCH piercings. So a wider tube is inserted underneath the hood and you pierce down into it. And when using a tube, I can see why the QTip test would be, your best guide for if you could or couldn't do this on someone. But as piercing has changed and techniques have advanced, we have a lot better techniques for performing these piercings, and freehanding them bottom to top gives us a lot more accessibility to do these, a lot more anatomies. And it breaks my heart that I see so many people feel like they have to give up on their dream piercing because they failed the QTip test, when the QTip test is honestly very dated for modern techniques. My other gripe with the QTip test is that it doesn't really take into account larger clitorises or alternative gender anatomy. I have a lot of trans clients who definitely could not comfortably fit a whole Q-tip under their hood, but have plenty of space and room underneath their hood. A Q-tip is just a little bit too wide and a little bit too dry, even with some lubrication, to comfortably fit underneath there. And plenty of clients who have slightly more recessed anatomy and a larger, more pronounced clitoris where there's still a hood there that we can pierce, but again, trying to get underneath it with a full Q-tip or even a slightly defluffed Q-tip is really difficult. And of course, there's other factors that go into pierceability. I have clients who come in who are able to fit an entire Q-tip underneath their hood, but because of the way their anatomy rests, very recessed into the body, the Q-tip fit under there, but it was fitting under there pressing against the natural webbing that connects their hood to their clitoris. And if I were to pierce through that tissue, I could potentially sever important nerve endings. I've also had clients come in who passed the QTip test, but there was major blood flow right through where we would need to do the piercing. So even though they passed the QTip test, there was so much blood flow in that area that you could visibly see through the skin. It wasn't a safe idea for me to pierce through this client. And I've also had clients where their anatomy sits very much off to one side or the other. So while we could do the piercing, It would potentially struggle with issues of migration, irritation, and even rejection, and those just aren't risks a lot of folks want to take with a piercing in a sensitive area like this. So, not only does the Q-tip test often inaccurately inform who isn't able to get this done, with many people failing the Q-tip test but being great candidates for VCH, it also does the opposite. It lets some people think, oh, perfect, I have everything I need for VCH, when in reality, they're not great candidates for this piercing. So, if this is something that you've been considering and you want to just kind of check and see at home, I don't, give the Q-tip test a shot, see if it works for you. But if it doesn't, or it feels weird or wrong, don't feel like that has to be the end all be all of you getting this piercing. I would still always encourage you to get an in-person consultation with an experienced, reputable piercer who has a large number of both fresh and healed VCH piercings in their portfolio, who can assess your anatomy and let you know more. But I cannot tell you how often clients come in having failed the Q-tip test, but are absolutely still able to get a VCH piercing, especially with modern piercing techniques for doing these piercings. So don't let this little test necessarily make you give up on your dream. Go get checked by a reputable piercer, and who knows, you might still be able to get that piercing you've always wanted after all. All right, folks, thanks so much for hanging out, and I can't wait to sit down and chat with you again soon. Bye.